Hansen, class of 2005, from the University Advancement Division here at St. Lawrence, and I will be helping to moderate tonight's lecture. We're very excited to offer this lecture series as a way for alumni, parents, and friends to experience today's classroom firsthand. Tonight's lecture is our 13th in the series, and we look forward to many more to come. Before we get started, I would like to cover a few technical items that should help make your webinar experience a more enjoyable one. At various points throughout the lecture, we will pause to invite comments and questions. At that time, you can virtually raise your hand using the hand icon on the navigation pane that you see at the top right of your screen. The icon is a small hand in blue-orange towards the bottom of that bar. Click it once to raise your hand. When you're called on, you will be unmuted and you can ask your question directly. Or two, you can type a question or comment in the box. A few tips about the webinar audio. If you're using the audio through your computer, please know that you must have a built-in microphone or an external microphone in order to ask questions. Otherwise, you will be able to hear us, but we won't be able to hear you. If you are using telephone audio, if you have your phone on speaker, in order for us to hear your question, you will likely need to take the speaker off during that time. We recommend that during the presentation, you minimize the navigation pane by using the orange arrow near the top to minimize the pane. If you need to maximize the pane to ask a question, simply use the orange arrow to maximize it. At this time, I'm thrilled to introduce our lecturer for the evening. She arrived at St. Lawrence University in 2008, having taught at Gettysburg College for 9 years. She earned her MA from Boston College and her PhD from SUNY at Stony Brook in philosophy. During her tenure in Canton, she's worked as the chair of the philosophy department, the coordinator of gender and sexuality studies, and assumed the position of associate dean of the first year in the summer of 2014. She co-edits a variety of publications and has authored numerous articles and book chapters, including A Virtue-Based Approach to Neuroenhancement in the Context of Psychiatric Practice, Is Prozac a Feminist Drug, and What's So Great About Nature? Tonight, she is set to present her lecture, Is Psychiatry the Bioengineering of Personality? Please welcome Dr. Jenny Hansen.
Hi. Thanks for having me. It's the first time that I've done a webinar, and I'm excited to see some names that have popped up that I recognize. So hopefully some of you will ask me questions. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is actually new work, but it's a variation on the same theme. I've been working on this issue for a long time, but I'm moving into a different part of it. I'll try to explain that, but it's still very new, so any questions that you have will be helpful to me. So the title is very provocative. Probably got some of you to sign up for it. And so the first thing you might want to know is what's the answer to the question. And so the answer is yes, insofar, and this is kind of a mouthful, but it's, to kind of give you what I think I'm going to argue, and you can hold me to it, but basically that it is a kind of bioengineering of personality insofar that we have certain protocols for psychiatric diagnosis that have medicalized, have considered pathological, normal, expectable grief and even despair. And then as a consequence of that, what I will describe later on as the bioengineering treatment stance. That stance, when it kicks in, starts picking out certain personality traits as predictive of proneness to depressive disease. And among those traits are things like compassion and pensiveness. I'll focus on those, and that might be clearer later. So that's what I hope to convince you of, and let's see how I do. So before I get into the argument, I wanted to step back because there may be some people listening to this who don't understand what a philosopher is doing talking about this topic in the first place, and someone who doesn't have a PhD in neuroscience nor an MD. So I thought I'd give a little bit of an overview about why philosophers are interested in psychiatry these days and what I think the role philosophy can play, the meaningful role philosophy can play in debates in psychiatry today. So first of all, I take it that philosophy as a discipline now serves more of a critical function than a speculative function. And what I mean by that is before, say, I don't know, the 19th century, maybe even earlier, philosophy was both criticizing arguments, and also building theories about what nature was like. And I think much of that latter work, the speculative work, has been taken over by the sciences. And so what philosophy still contributes, I think, to the sciences is helping people who are trained into those disciplines step back and think about what they're doing when they're thinking through the discipline. So what I try to tell students and why they should study philosophy, and parents why they should feel glad that their students or children are studying philosophy, is that studying philosophy helps you think about the way you think and decide whether or not what you're thinking is plausible. Is there good evidence for it? Is it reasoned well? Have you made any errors in reasoning? And there's many, by the way, in this debate. That you've defined your terms. Everybody uses terms sometimes in different ways, and you need to make sure that your audience understands the way you're using the terms, or you're not having the same conversation. What the implications are of any theory that you adhere to, or any method that you use, or any hypothesis that you would pose, thinking it through, thinking it out. If this is true, what then? Also, I think philosophers are good at trying to ferret out what is nonsense, what seems like it says something important, but actually when you, sort of analyze it, it falls apart and says really nothing. So we're trying to detect what is sense and nonsense. And then lastly, and I think for me this is one of the more important things, is that philosophers try to help people think through values and goals. They don't tell people what they should value, and they don't tell people what their goals should be, but they ask them to reflect on them, because most of us think that we are operating with them whether we're aware of them or not. And sometimes some of our worst actions are because we didn't reflect on what our values and goals were, and we didn't think through if what we were going to do was going to be in line with those things. So I have there again this idea that philosophers think things through slowly. In fact, my friends and I always joke that when we are kind of attending to, say, other disciplines and they're working through things, we're always the ones to raise our hand and say, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's go back to the first sentence there and figure out what you were saying. Like, what did you mean by, we're very slow. And I put that word pensive there because, as you remember, one of the traits that I think is being sort of targeted as proneness to depression is that attitude, that pensive, slow thinking attitude, not immediately decisive, not efficient. And then philosophers are also, they only think when they're in dialogue or argument with other people. And so all of my work has started by having an argument with a book that came out in 1993 by Peter Kramer called Listening to Prozac. And I just keep having the argument in different ways. And the argument's healthy for me because there are things that make me rethink my own positions and things that I think, wait a minute, that can't be true, but then I have to figure out why it's not true. And so dialogue and argument are ways of planting naysayers when you're thinking through ideas that if you don't plant there, you are likely to be reasoning things in ways that are coming up with answers you prefer to have rather than what should be the answers. So that was long-winded, but this is kind of what I think philosophers are doing now. And then in the realm of philosophy, in psychiatry, I'm waiting for the slide. Okay, so there's a couple of different, this is actually a real field. It's not a very old field, but there are a couple of different areas in which philosophers are interested in psychiatry. And I mean specifically psychiatry, although there are related issues there with psychology. But one of the biggest issues that I think that's drawn in philosophers around the time that you had the anti-psychiatrists that were attacking psychiatry as a discipline, and you had the making of the new DSM-3 back in the 80s, is people started asking, well, what exactly is a mental disorder? Is a mental disorder actually something medical? Is it just a deviance that people are labeling? Is it completely relative to culture? And I think philosophers thought, well, there's a question that we like to think through. It's a conceptual question. So many have jumped in on that question. Then there's also epistemological questions. So when philosophers use this, they just mean sort of how do we know, and is this the right way to know something? What's the best way to know this? And so I've highlighted that one red because that's where I've gone right now. And I'll say more about it, but essentially what I've become more interested in the field of philosophy of psychiatry is the method that's become sort of the dominant method, which is this neuroscientific paradigm or stance that is basically just what psychiatrists take as the way to do psychiatry now, and what the implications are of adopting that particular framework almost exclusively to any other framework, which is not necessarily the case, but in the minds of many people in the public, that's all it is. And then there are plenty of philosophers that are interested in the question of what a mind is, especially with the rise of neuroscience and all the developments in neuroscience that are, talking about mental states as neurochemistry, as neurotransmission, as brain circuits. All of this kind of molecular work in the brain is, making a lot of people have to ask questions like, well, is that the same thing as a mind? Can we reduce a mind to brain states? Are mental states something epiphenomenal? Or that, there's all kinds of questions we're trying to sort out, and I don't think we've necessarily even gotten close to figuring that out. And then lastly, the questions that are most common, I think, to people who have any familiarity with these issues on psychiatry and psychiatric medicines are ethical questions. And so the question that got me into this field in the first place, as I said, the book that started me in an argument for about 20 years, is it morally permissible for psychiatrists to offer medications for enhancement rather than treatment purposes? And that was the question that caught my attention when the new antidepressants came out, the SSRI antidepressants like Prozac, particularly the most famously known one. And so, so what I'll do is give you a little bit of the background to my current project. So what I'm talking about now is not necessarily what I'm going to get to in this talk, but it's maybe just telling you a story about how I got to where I am now. And how slowly, for some of those people on here who are my students, they'll see how slowly I've been thinking through this. But so I got interested in this, as I said, by the enhancement question. And that question was posed in a couple of different places. The first time it was posed, at least in the way that I'm thinking about it, which was by Dr. Peter Kramer. He called it cosmetic psychopharmacology. He posed this question in Listening to Prozac, but then I think that his book got read in ways differently than he intended. I think he was posing some philosophical, ethical questions, but not just ethical. Some of them were questions about personal identity. And then later on, when some philosophers, I think, maybe started taking it up, he then contributed to the Hastings Center report, Bioethics Journal, and he phrased it differently. And so I have it here, and one way he's phrased it is, imagine we have to hand a medication that can move a person from a normal psychological state to another psychological state that is more desired or better socially rewarded. What are the moral consequences of that potential? And he was using the language of cosmetic psychopharmacology because I think he was trying to make a connection to cosmetic surgery, so that now we may have medications that can change personality in the way that people want to change their bodies, so that they are better, that they're better rewarded, and that they have a better social life, or they can advance in the workplace. And so I was interested in this, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it, and so I dove into the literature. And there's about 3 camps. There's probably more, but I'm just going to say 3 because that's easiest. There's 3 camps, and are different ways in which people have approached this ethical question. And again, I'm just giving you this as the background. I'm not necessarily going to get into the ethical question. I'm just going to try to show you how I got to where I am now. And so the most common, and the way that I think people answered Kramer's question was this first way, which was to kind of think about this from the most dominant bioethics approach, which is the principle-based approach or principles approach. So that, well, we have to think about this in terms of patient autonomy. Does it respect patient autonomy to allow them to, to prescribe them medications that aren't necessarily things that are clinically required, but they nonetheless have a beneficial effect for them, or they're subclinical and there's a beneficial effect? Is this respecting patient autonomy? Is it a benefit to the patient? Am I not doing harm to the patient? Is there any coercion involved? These are the kind of principles that a lot of bioethicists weigh, and neuroethicists have taken up as well. It's a new field, neuroethics, because now we're talking about brain states. I think that a lot of people landed on saying, yeah, it's probably morally permissible as long as you're respecting the autonomy and the cost and the benefits ratio is okay, and the person is fully informed of what he or she is getting him or herself into. And you know, I could see the arguments, I was convinced by them, but they never satisfied me. And then I started looking at the other kind of camp, which was interested in the more metaphysical question about, am I the same person that I was before I took, say, if I'm the kind of person that when I take something like Prozac or Zoloft or some other antidepressant, and you could even talk about older antidepressants. If I take that and now I'm a different, if I have different characteristics, if I'm different temperamentally, am I the same person that I was before? So that's one of those questions. The other one is, if I, you know, do this and I want to do this and I even like myself better, am I really being authentic to myself? Or am I just kind of pandering, I guess, to social norms? Or, you know, you can figure out ways to sort of think through that one. And then lastly, there are, and I'm actually pretty interested in this area, but I never got into it, is there's the kind of social distributive justice questions. And this actually is a little clearer when you think about things like cognitive enhancement. So if it's the case that, say, students at St. Lawrence could take some kind of ADHD medication, and not because they're actually diagnosed, but you know, just because they've found that it has the effect of improving their capacity to remember things when they're studying and help them stay more focused and alert. Is there any reason why they shouldn't take them? And so we could answer that question in the ways that 1 and 2 went, but then some people might say, well, okay, let's say that it's okay, but then now what you're doing is you're giving people who already have a lot of economic and political, you know, power, more power, because even though, you know, theoretically this is available to everyone, it's going to be probably the people that already have an advantage that are going to have access to this. And so even if we say, okay, it's okay, we still might have to deal with the outcomes of that. We've created greater economic and political inequality by allowing for enhancement. So those are just the 3 kind of positions in the debate. And so I tried to find my way in. And as Joe told you, the most recent paper that I just wrote was me finally taking a stance on the question, which took years because I just couldn't figure out what I thought. And I decided to take a virtue-based approach, which is not the dominant approach in bioethics. And I decided to look at it from the standpoint of the clinician and whether or not giving a medicine to a patient when it's not clinically indicated anymore, but the patient derives a benefit from it, whether or not that is harmful to the doctor-patient relationship. So that was probably the only straight-up ethics paper I've ever written, and you know, we'll see how that plays out if anyone reads it. And then the other way that I kind of entered into this debate was the paper also that Joe read is I co-authored this with Ginger Hoffman, is Prozac a feminist drug? And in this paper, I thought more about the female that might be looking to get this medication. What kinds of things should she ask herself or think through before deciding to get a prescription, and not just actually for enhancement purposes, even for just treatment purposes. And were there some, you know, particular issues related to gender in that debate. So those are my 2 attempts, and to be honest, I still felt unsatisfied by this neuroethics debate. I still felt as if I couldn't really unravel what was drawing me to this information, you know, in the first place. And so, okay, so now I'll do the next slide. So now, I guess what I did is I kept going back to like, all right, what's bothering me? What's bothering me about this debate? And so here I'm just putting critical function again. Here's the philosopher in me saying, what's wrong? What are they missing? And part of what I think they were missing was this sort of gender blind spot. Obviously, I addressed it somewhat in that is Prozac a feminist drug debate, but there were just other things about the actual practice of, say, drug marketing and who was taking the medications or who they were being prescribed to and who was being diagnosed that I felt like wasn't making a meaningful entrance into those debates. And so what I'm going to show you now, and maybe just because they're both really funny but frightening, is a bunch of drug ads that I started to look at. The first one that I looked at is later on in the series that I'm going to show you, and I saw it first right after the FDA changed sort of the rules about how drugs could be advertised to the public. But once I started looking at these, I went back and looked at a bunch of them. So the first series that I'm going to show you are from the, let's say, anxiety era. So the drugs that are being prescribed are like benzodiazepines, like Valium. And then we're going to switch and look at the ads from, say, the late 90s until basically now for antidepressants. So we can just look and pause at a couple of them. You can sort of think about them. So the first one is, from an earlier era. And I think what I want you to pay attention to in these ads is who is being depicted and what is the story that's being told. And so here you have, obviously, you're targeting a housewife. And, how are you going to make her less anxious? I don't know, about having her house cleaned or making sure she's ironing correctly, but whatever. How are you going to address this sort of anxiety that the housewife has? And so then we'll move to the next one. Again, another sort of housewife. This is kind of probably the era when you have Betty Friedan writing the feminine mystique, the sort of women whose problem has no name. They're just sort of maybe overly educated and bored out of their minds. And so they're being targeted for these anxiety medications. And then the next one, I love this one. It's so frightening. Actually, there's even worse. Here again, you have this. This is who the patient is, and that's who the doctor is, right? So the doctor is this elderly white male doctor, and the patient is, again, some housewife or elderly housewife who's in despair and unhappy, and there's probably all kinds of consequences for her household, and so she's coming in to get treatment. And then here's one for Thorazine, which was the first psychopharmacological medicine discovered and was originally found to be helpful in schizophrenic patients that were in the asylum, and then I guess, got prescribed to insane housewives. Okay, and then the next one, here you have a mom, and this kind of reminds me of my mom's era because she had me and my brother 14 months apart and, was probably out of her mind, and so she was prescribed some kind of benzodiazepine, and this is the kind of thing that would have been probably something she would have seen. And then this is the last ad from that era, which is for Valium. So, these are things I'm looking at and thinking, there's something here that there's a person that's being depicted and marketed to in these ads, and they're not in the debate in any meaningful way. Now we're going to switch to the ads that are more contemporary for pharmaceuticals. So the first one is, this is the first ad I ever saw about the time that I got interested in Kramer's book, about almost the same year. And what you have now, though, is you have still a female who's being targeted by the ad, but it's not a housewife. It's somebody who's in the workplace. Somebody who's probably still married. I think she has a wedding ring on, and maybe even has a family. But her concerns are not her family at the moment. Her concerns are, how does she balance working now and her home? And then here's another one. This one is actually not for an antidepressant, it's for a sleeping pill. But again, it's targeting this. It's no longer targeting the housewife. You're targeting the business professional, the female business professional. And then the next one, this was a big series from Prozac before they lost their patent, and they were doing a lot of advertising. Here you have a series, and this one is Barb's golfing again, just like normal. And then the next one is the one I think about the most. This one is for Zoloft, and I'll come back again why I think about this one the most. But here you have a woman who's clearly a soccer mom, right? Except she's a professional soccer mom. So she's somebody who works all day and then still has to be able to get her kids to practice and be home and do this balance. So I'm just showing you these ads to sort of show you what got me interested in this, because I felt like there was something going on in these ads that wasn't addressed in the debate. And at this point, I'm about to move to my next sort of, the next part of my discussion, which is really get into the where I am now with this stuff. But I thought I would stop and see if what I've laid out so far, which is basically just kind of the context and, what a philosopher is doing in this, see if you have any questions at the moment before I go on.
Yeah, so we're ready to take a few questions here. And so I see a few hands are up. And so I'm going to call out a couple names here. And when you hear your name, I'm going to please do read your question right into the microphone. So we're going to start first with James. You are on here. And so when you have a chance, ask your question to Dr. Hansen. James Call, are you with us, sir? All right, James, we're not hearing your question come through. We'll move on here to Beth Slater. Beth, we are waiting your question.
Oh, hi. I didn't push the button, so.
No problem.
Sorry. I'm enjoying it and I'm appreciating it. I don't have any questions yet, so I must have hit
completely fine.
Not a problem. Not a problem. All right. Well, we will come back for questions here as Dr. Hansen moves into her next phase of her project.
Okay. So, as I said, I felt as if what I was seeing in those advertisements and the story that was being told, clearly you have the same kind of person being targeted, but you're changing as the norms, I guess, for women change. First, you're targeting them as housewives and you're trying to sedate them in their house free, and then you're moving to sort of professional women who are still wives and trying to help them balance all that they're trying to do and succeed in professional environments. And so what I think is pretty obvious to anyone who's looking carefully at these, that there are very clear gendered personality norms that are being promoted in these pharmaceutical advertisements. And why? Why is that particular consumer being targeted, and why are those norms the ones that are being sold? That's kind of the question that I was trying to get at. So one hypothesis to answer this question that many people give, this is just to sort of tell you, here's the one hypothesis. So the next slide is, a way to think through this. Some people might say that it's just big pharma, that this is big money, right? That they are, very influential in trying to get their drugs as part of, whatever insurance plans, to get into doctors' offices, that they tend to make Me Too drugs rather than look for new compounds because, some of those are for good reasons because it's so expensive and time-consuming, but also because they want to get a market share, they be able to make a profit. If someone else has a similar drug, they have to differentiate a little bit. There's also people that point out incorrectly that in order to be able to market one of these medications, it has to be indicated for a disease, right? So you have this now need to think about things like depression, anxiety, schizophrenia as diseases. And so there's worry that you have manufactured a whole bunch of diseases that didn't exist before, like very low levels like depression or moderate depression. Then you have all kinds, social anxiety disorder, even ADHD might be in there, all kinds of diseases. You could even have some of the diseases be related to, eating disorders or whatnot, things that you can say are a disease and then you can legitimately market a drug to them. And then, of course, there's just the obvious, if you're thinking about this from a business standpoint, that women are reliable consumers. They're more likely to, go to the doctor. And they're also going to be influenced by those very, I'd say, straight-up sexist ideas that are being peddled in those ads. They're either going to be influenced like, I think a lot of them it's going to play on fears. It's going to play on their fears, and it's going to play on maybe the fears of the people in their life, right? So if you have, your mom's working a crazy busy job, and she has a little kid, and she has to manage all this stuff, and she never sleeps. Not that I'm describing myself, but she never sleeps. She's never, got everything on top of. She's not on top of everything, and you see this ad that says maybe it's, maybe it's anxiety disorder, and someone can go, oh, that's what it is. You should go see the doctor. So there's that kind of fear, like, wow, this would be quicker. Maybe it's just a simple pill that's the fix, not like the fact that she's completely overworked and there's no way she can handle all that work. Or it can play on, women's own fears of not measuring up to what are the norms of succeeding in the marketplace in professional environments. So, that could be the explanation. That could be all it is, that those ads are just doing that. They're just trying to make money, and they're able to do so because all of these factors. They can influence, the FDA. They can influence the laws for how to prescribe or how to advertise, et cetera. But for me, that wasn't fully satisfying. I'm not disagreeing with it. I do think there's a lot of truth in it. I think there's a lot of good books about this that are worth reading. But for me, there was something going on that was maybe speaking to me in those ads that had also something to do with the scientific framework of psychiatry today. That it wasn't just that you had kind of psychiatry and neuroscience in that world over here, and then they're trying to sort of think through a different paradigm, and then you have the drug companies coming along and just sort of like exploiting this and using it for their own gain. I thought that there was something going on in the actual scientific approach and method that was lending itself to those ads. And so that's why I moved from a kind of ethical approach on these issues to an epistemological approach. And so I will talk a little bit about where I am on this issue right now. And here's where it gets kind of into my new stuff, and please, if I didn't make sense, ask questions. So what I will say that I think most people agree with is that psychiatry now has what is called a neuroscientific paradigm or a biomedical paradigm, or I'd call it a stance, but generally that the days of Freudian psychoanalysis or existential analysis or all of those kind of psychotherapeutic-based approaches that thought about mental illness in terms of social context or psychological, psychogenic issues, so that you might be someone who suffered childhood abuse or trauma, or that you might be living in a sexist environment or a racist environment, or you might be in a war-torn environment, or all of these sort of explanations that your mother was the problem, or your family life sucks, or your marriage is a problem. All those things were kind of the paradigm, and some people still think that's what they're saying when they think they're going to the psychiatrist. But more and more now, I think that what we've done, and I think successfully convinced the public, is that no, the problem is your neurochemistry, that it's a chemical imbalance that's going on here. It's a molecular problem. Yeah, sure, there's all these social psychogenic factors, but they're not really driving the problem. They're just enhancing the problem. And so, so what you have are sort of different theories floated around. I have under the kind of molecular causes that maybe it's a kind of pathogen, kind of similar to, say, the way when bacteriology first came around and they found that there were actually compounds they could make that would knock out an illness, something like syphilis. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, it was just that. And we gave them a medication and it's gone. So maybe that's what's going on here. And, if we find the right sort of compound, we'll fix the problem, fix the wiring or fix the whatever cellular problem. And then another, very common, a very common one that you probably anyone who's listening to this has seen an ad on is that it's just a chemical signaling problem. And in particular in the case of depression, it's a serotonin problem. So then you have, related to this neuroscientific stance, people, and this is kind of on a higher level. I don't think that the public's doing this, but you have people thinking about, okay, well, it's a disease. Let's call it a disease, but what kind of disease is it? And so the harmful dysfunction approach is the one that, at least in the DSM-IV, was adopted. And it was a way to kind of combine that it's a medical problem with a social context, so that it is a problem in functioning, biological functioning, but only insofar as that you are not able to function in the current social context you are, right? So that's one kind of model. And then what's kind of getting more popular, and I don't even know if I'm correctly calling it this way, but this is how I see it, is that people are starting to now think about it as it's like a autoimmune disease. So something that you have a kind of inherited genetic proneness to, and certain events, like the ones I described before, can then create a cycle that eventually downstream leads to a full-blown disease like psoriasis, or I can't think of another example right now, but maybe someone out there will. So those are kind of the new questions in the epistemological paradigm and the new ways of thinking about it. And so on this next slide, this then is what I call someone who's adopted the absolutely exclusive neuroscientific stance in psychiatry. And this is a quotation from Francis Crick. And I just think it says a lot, which is, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Now, that catches any philosopher's, I think, attention, but probably anyone else's, to think that, okay, so we're just neurons, right? But there is that current, I think, in psychiatry, in clinicians, and also in the research side of things. And not because necessarily either of those camps of people are thinking this through. They aren't necessarily thinking this, but they're being trained into this worldview to look at the molecular level, and then they're not thinking through like a philosopher would, well, what does it mean to say that everything about my personality or everything about, you know, what I've become or the choices I've made can be explained on that molecular level. And so there's, you know, consequences to adopting that view that interests me. And so the next slide that I'm going to show you are the way that I've started to think about what is built into this. So let me just back up for a second and say that as I enter into this debate about epistemology, I'm really kind of like going into new territory, and I'm getting interested in philosophy of science, and particularly a lot of stuff that came out of feminist critiques of philosophy of science, but not exclusively, namely to recognize that science was not value-free, that there were norms or values that were embedded in scientific frameworks. Some of those norms may be just about what counts as a good theory, or, you know, why should I choose one theory over another, and some of them might actually be certain contextual values that people value. So in the United States, that might be things like efficiency or upbeat, vital, you know, and things like that. And so I was trying to kind of start filling out for myself, what are the different assumptions, background assumptions, namely things that are built into adopting this neuroscientific stance if you're being trained into it. But no one ever says, by the way, in the lab as I train you in these techniques and methods, and I teach you the kind of like what we know about how things work, you should also know that if we step back one level, it means that you are now a reductionist, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And some of these things are obvious to the people that are doing this, that yes, it takes a reductionist standpoint. Now we're not thinking on the higher level, we're thinking about sort of what are the, what's the molecular machinery that is producing an effect on the psychological level. And mechanism is important too. We're not talking about souls. We're not talking about something disembodied. We're talking about human beings as nothing more than very sophisticated machines. That's how medicine thinks about them, at least the sort of mainstream medicine. Obviously, there's plenty of other branches that are not necessarily going with that assumption, but I'd say that, you know, most medicine, including psychiatry, views and biology and all of these sciences assumes that we can study human anatomy, physiology, you know, brain, chemistry, so everything, as if we are just sophisticated machines, and try to understand what the purpose of all these little parts are and when it's working and when it's not working. And then the neuroscientific stance does have a sophisticated view of gene-environment interaction. So when I say genetic determinism, I don't mean some of the stuff that people thought in the day when you could find the gene for, you know, gayness, or you could find the gene for criminality. I think those are naive views, and that nobody's going to make that claim, at least anyone who's thought carefully about the way science works. But what they'll say is you have maybe some aspects of you've inherited certain things about you, the kind of genes that you've inherited may be such that in certain environmental contexts, things will happen that will lead to a disorder or a disease process, or also things that will be good. Maybe it will influence what language you will speak, or, you know, what kind of skills you'll develop. There's all these complicated ways in which genes are just interacting with a larger environment, and I think that that's what I mean when I say genetic determinism. But I'm going to say more about why I still think I'm going to use the word genetic determinism instead of gene environment. And then lastly, this is more on the value side of things. I think that the neuroscientific, because it thinks of human beings as mechanisms, then it's thinking about what's the optimal function of those mechanisms. We tend to think when we're thinking about mechanisms of what was this machine made for? What is, you know, why was it selected for? What is an adaptation for that somehow, you know, serve the purposes of fitness? Okay, so we're going on. So that's the background assumptions, and all of the stuff I'm just trying to lay out for you is what I think is going on in this big turn in neuroscience. I mean, in psychiatry, the neuroscience paradigm. And then you have this difference in theory. Let's say you have a different idea about how we should study. What am I trying to say? What the nature of mental illness is, how to diagnose it. And then that theory is influencing methods. So, and it's influencing what we think are the right, rigorous, most rational ways to do this work, at least in psychiatry. And there's obviously different norms for the work in neuroscience. And so what you have in medicine, all medicine, but including psychiatry, is this move, first of all, to an evidence-based medicine approach, which means in the case of psychiatry that you're relying less and less on, say, a clinician's experience and judgment. You know, they're going to have to actually use protocols that have been derived from careful double-blind studies and meta-analyses of those studies, and you know, that somehow the statistical modeling of those things is going to give, on average, better diagnoses than just clinical judgment. You have in medical schools the disappearance. You still have some training in psychotherapy, but it's usually validated short-term psychotherapy like cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal therapy. And you don't really have necessarily people who are coming out of med school and in their, I can't think of the word right now, residency, actually even seeing a patient in a psychotherapeutic situation. And then you also had the change in the DSM from the DSM-2 to the DSM-3. You went from, the DSM, I should have said this earlier, is the, I'm going to forget the name, it's the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Illness. And the earlier editions kind of tried to describe the origin of the illness as well as what the illness looked like. So it gave sort of a theory of what it was, and it was more grounded in some of these, not always, there were some organic theories, like especially for things like schizophrenia or more of the delusional psychotic states, but it also had some things about family structure and, you know, cultural context. And that was replaced by the DSM-3, which provided instead sort of lists of symptoms that, you know, a clinician was guided to pick a certain number to choose that diagnosis. And theoretically, the DSM doesn't give any account of what is causing the mental illness. It's just saying, this is what we take to be depression, these signs and symptoms. And so if you see this in your patient, it's depression, and then you follow the protocols for how to treat it. But underneath that is an assumption that it's a neurobiological process, that it is something that can be ultimately explained that way, and that's been the case even up until now, the DSM-5. That's kind of their hope. So when people are diagnosing, not all people, there's plenty of people that aren't psychiatrists, that aren't general practitioners, that aren't in medicine at all, that use that, and probably with a grain of salt, because they have to use it for, you know, insurance purposes. But there are many people that think, you know, this is what the evidence is, and this is what I'm going to code it for, and this is how I'm going to treat it because this is what all the researchers have done studies on. And that led to then this larger view of thinking about things like depression as diseases. And that gets articulated. So Peter Kramer writes this book in '93, Listening to Prozac, very philosophical, speculative, fun kind of book, and then goes on the road, gives this talk, and everyone's saying, you know, how could you say we should be giving Prozac to you know, people like Nietzsche or Marx? You know, they were great because they were melancholic, you know, people, and they were pensive, and that pissed him off enough that he wrote a book called Against Depression, where he just flat out argued depression is a disease, and it's like an autoimmune disease, and you need to treat it early and often. And then another way that a sociologist has described this current sort of moment of methods is the pill paradigm. So even if you are, as a clinician, saying, okay, I think you need, you know, some therapy, it's still a kind of therapy that you can measure the outcomes for, that's been validated. It's not sort of like, I don't know, let's go on indefinitely and see where we go with it. All right. Should I stop there for a second, maybe? Is there anyone who wants to, like, I just went through a lot of kind of the complicated stuff that might be worth me stopping before I go on to the last part of my argument.
Certainly. We do have a question that has come in, and it was typed in. So the question is, would you agree that managed care, for example, HMOs, are equally invested with big pharma in driving the neuroscientific stance that our mental health issues are primary biological and are better treated with a pill instead of slower treatment process of psychotherapy? And that question was from Kenneth.
Yeah, I do think that is a driver of this, the HMOs, but not just the HMOs. I would say many insurance or whatever, the insurance companies out there that are trying to contain costs, hospitals that are trying to contain costs. They're looking for what seems to be effective and efficient ways of diagnosing and treating, and again, relying more on statistical modeling than the art of the physician's judgment and experience, because the latter is probably too expensive. I mean, we see this in education as well. You know, people want to see outcomes and they want to see assessment, and not just sort of think that the thing's happening because of some magical quality of the clinician or the doctor. I mean, the teacher. And so yeah, all of those things are definitely driving this, and therefore that's why I think it's become such the norm, and it's very unlikely that you're going to have psychiatrists that are going to just, you know, sort of work outside of that paradigm. Okay, so any other questions or?
Yes, another question has come in here. This is a question from Brian, and he points out that it comes down to time and reimbursements, actually.
Yeah, partly. I mean, I actually looked at some studies done on, I was curious the degree to which psychiatrists are interested, at least in medical school, whether they're interested in doing psychotherapy, or if, you know, I looked at a lot of that literature, and one of the articles, I can't remember the title, but it looked at if there is any loss in income if you choose to do more psychotherapy than medical management. And not necessarily, because you might get more of the sort of non-insurance payers if you're doing psychotherapy. But I do think that there's more incentive to move people through more quickly and get reimbursed more than psychotherapy. So yeah, I think it's valid.
All right. Well, thank you for those questions. And do remind you, there are two ways to ask the questions. You can ask, as Brian and Kenneth did there, by typing in the questions into the box, and I'm happy to read them on your behalf. If you do have a built-in microphone on your computer, do raise your hand by clicking the raise your hand button, and we can unmute you, and you can ask your question to Jenny directly as we carry on here with Dr. Hansen.
Okay, and let me just say, I'm leaving so much out of this story. I'm just trying to get it down to this one brief period, so there's things I'd be happy to talk about in the questions that I haven't even addressed. But okay, so all of this move to the neuroscientific paradigm has meant essentially that psychotherapy is, while not prescribed or recommended for patients, is certainly not seen as, I mean, I've even read one guide, sort of informational guide put out there saying that it's irresponsible to only get psychotherapy if you are diagnosed with not just major depression, but dysthymia or, you know, depressive disorder with melancholic features. Any of those things, it's like it's irresponsible if you don't also get some kind of medication for that treatment to go along with it. And so part of, I guess, the way that the evidence-based protocols have influenced medicine is that the physician, and this is again maybe back to this point about reimbursement, the physician is not listening to the history. And this is true in all medicine. Like, having just been in and out of emergency room all last week, a lot of people don't take time to do a history, right? But you know, you see that it's slightly more, it's more concerning, I think, in psychiatry because of there's a lot of things we could talk about why it's just so tricky, that doctor-patient relationship. But in general, you have sort of clinicians that are more interested in listening to what the symptoms are and then finding the protocol to treat it than to understand the larger context. And then you have this other thing going on in the DSM-5, which was really surprising, but they removed the bereavement exclusion. So it used to be the case that you could be diagnosed with depression if you met a certain list of symptoms, but unless someone passed away or you had a major job loss, there might be reasons to rule that out, except if it lasted maybe a certain period of time. And now, if you go look at the DSM-5, it says you shouldn't necessarily rule it out because you can explain it in terms of context. And that interests me, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But that means, of course, that you're just really listening to the symptoms. It doesn't matter why they're there. You're just trying to figure out what the diagnosis is based on the symptoms. And then you also have just some values in general guiding the practice of medicine. Is you want, what the gold standards are is you want proven efficacy of a treatment, whether it be psychotherapy or a medicine, and that efficacy is determined in those clinical trials. And God, that's a whole other talk. And then you also want it to be something efficient, not protracted, not seeming to go on forever, like sitting on the couch in the psychiatrist's office in Manhattan and spending your next 30 years paying to try to work out your issues. So that's where we are. So we can move on now to what I'm calling the bioengineering stance. And so because you have a neuroscientific stance and you are seeing human beings as mechanisms, you are seeing them at least when you're looking at them with an eye as a researcher, and then that research is translated to the clinician, you're looking at them as mechanisms that have some kind of malfunction that you need to fix. And the word optimize comes back here because what we want to do with machines is we want to optimize their functioning. So I think that treatment now more and more is a kind of bioengineering, because not only are we using, in the case of medications, molecules that have been synthesized or engineered in order to affect brain chemistry, but you're also trying with those medications to optimize certain parts of what you think are good engineering of a person's neurochemistry or brain functioning, and then to either inoculate or fix, if possible, the bad engineering. So that's kind of where I think that's what we're doing. That's the project right now if we're treating patients as psychiatrists. And I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know why I said we. So then the next question then is, okay, well, if the goal here is to optimize good engineering, well, what exactly is the good engineering? Because in the background of all of this is we have no way of pointing out in the brain where the cause of the problem is. There's no biological markers. There's no sort of brain imaging study you could do that would determine for sure that this is the problem. We don't know exactly which receptors are involved. We don't even know if we know all the neurotransmitters are involved. All of those things haven't been sorted out. So you just kind of go with this hunch that we're going to figure it out. We're going to let the neuroscientists figure it out, and we'll just keep applying whatever they have figured out, because we do have this need to treat people who are suffering. But then what is the good engineering? So one way to answer that question that I have there is take one, is to say, well, whatever is the list of symptoms in the DSM that would diagnose you as depressive, well, whatever are the opposite of that is, good stuff, right? So if, instead of feeling hopeless, if you're a kind of optimistic person, or instead of being sad and weepy, you're more, kind of upbeat. If you enjoy life and all of its little things, if you are very good at making decisions quickly, don't feel a lot of guilt, your appetite, all that stuff's good. Maybe that means that that person has some good engineering. So let's take the person who has the opposite of those traits, and we'll assume that that's a sign that they have good engineering, the kind of stuff we want to maximize or optimize in our treatment. And take two, which is related to this, and this is coming out of this sort of autoimmune disorder paradigm, is that maybe what we want to do is target resilience, the neuroresilience, so that there are blows that can happen to neurotransmission or other systems, other cells in the brain, and that are brought on because of, again, these background social or psychological events. And that the people that get depressed are the ones who don't have built-in neuroresilience, so that their neurons themselves are not strong enough to withstand those sort of things that all of us have to deal with as human beings. And so what we need to do is figure out how to go right to the neurons themselves and optimize that. And so that then leads me to this. Another way to kind of describe this is, and going back to this idea about the bereavement exclusion, is that so following this line of thinking, one hypothesis, again put out by Peter Kramer, is that maybe what depression is, because he's also trying to account for the fact that women are more likely to be diagnosed than men, is maybe what happened is that what was selected for what were traits that are vital to human survival, which are traits for caring and nurturing or attachment, affiliation, or things that we think are important for mothers, that those were selected for. But then what came along with that, unfortunately, was these proneness to disease. So you select for those traits, but then this other kind of unfortunate byproduct comes along. And the reason I use spandrel there is I'm taking it from a paper written in the late 70s by Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewitton, where they basically were actually arguing against people who wanted to say that every function in the body was it's an adaptation, that it is there because it was serving a purpose. And they wanted to say, no, not necessarily. Some traits or things are there in human beings because in order to have constructed one of them, you needed to construct the other. And so spandrels, and I'm probably going to describe this wrong because I'm not an architect or art historian, but I think that there are these sort of architectural pieces that hold up domed ceilings in, say, Gothic cathedrals. And so you want the dome ceiling. That's what you're selecting for. That's what you're going for. But to get it, you have to then you have to kind of realize, oh, right, I have to build this spandrel to hold it up. And that's not what your primary goal was. So, I mean, what Kramer is saying is the primary goal was to make nurturing human beings and select for those. But unfortunately, what came along with it were some tendencies, and not all people, to then get depressed because they're caring, because they care about people that have problems. So then they get depressed, and then the depression then gets worse, and it's cyclical, and then it kind of becomes this, stress response, or the stress response of your brain is deteriorating, and you can't handle it, and boom, you have a full-blown disease. So that's sort of his hypothesis. And what's interesting about that hypothesis is, again, I said this a couple times, the bereavement exclusion, is that what that means then is that when we say that there's a gene-environment interaction, what's driving it is not the environment. What's driving it is the inherited proneness, right? So that some people are going to be having similar awful situations in life or having similar friends with problems that make them sad, but they're just going to have this kind of neuroresilience that others do, so they won't ever show any kind of symptoms of depression, right? And I guess I should have added before that the reason they had the bereavement exclusion was because the symptoms for grief are basically the same as the symptoms for depression, but we think culturally that grief makes sense. It's responsive to a situation that you can make sense of, whereas depression is supposed to not make sense. It's supposed to come from nowhere. But now you have this idea that it doesn't matter if it makes sense or not. If it's there, then you probably have some bad engineering. You have some proneness to it. So this kind of gets me to this point of the talk, which is that what we end up doing when we're treating is we're bioengineering personality. Not all treatments. I mean, I'm really thinking more about the minor, moderate depressions, the kind of patients that are being depicted in those ads, right? I think there are some serious suffering that people have, mental suffering, and that need lots of research, and we need to do more to understand the mechanisms. But I think that what we've done is we've expanded the number of people that can be diagnosed with these mental illnesses, and that we, instead of kind of treating mental illness, we're now optimizing badly engineering traits that are selected for because people need to care for their young or others to survive. And so, what we're doing is we're trying to build in neuroprotectants that make people resilient. And I'll show you the next slide. This is a specific example, and this is where I first got the idea that I was going to call this a bioengineering stance. Is that Kramer, in that book I told you about, Against Depression, he's admittedly being very speculative. He's not saying this is going to happen or is happening, but he says he can imagine that in the future, with all these kind of different studies being done, that we will be able to take, certain molecules and bioengineer them, and then send them in there, and they'll become neuroprotectant. And he, says, his quote is that that you'll assure that your prefrontal cortex cells will not be stripped of protection, your hippocampal cells die, your neural connections will stay intact, and new nerve cell pathways will be formed. So the idea here is that what we'll do is we'll make people safe for caring, right? We'll let them still care for people, but we'll just make sure that that doesn't ever make them weepy or sad or get involved in this process downstream that's going to lead to a full-blown disease. And that just fascinated me. Okay, so that's sort of the epistemological bit of my talk. And so now, as I said earlier, philosophers like to think about consequences. So here's at least one, and I could probably list a lot more, but this is one word I'll share with you about one of the consequences of having adopted both the neuroscientific and bioengineering stance exclusively. Not that we adopted it because it works very well in some situations, but exclusively making it the only sort of method in treatment. is that the consequence is that we are favoring individuals that I'm calling hyperthymic, which is a set of traits down there that are not manic. So we don't see these people as like, you know, oh my God, that person's out of control. We see them as like, wow, look at that, like charismatic, always upbeat, you know, nothing really like bothers him or her, very charismatic, decisive, very effective in professional environments, competitive environments. That what we're doing is we're favoring those individuals because in this cultural context we live in, those people are doing well and they're not depressed and they're not, you know, seeming to get run down by the people in their lives who have problems or things that go on. So we're trying to make people who are maybe a bit pensive, like philosophers, or compassionate, people who care about larger social problems. We're trying to say, look, the real problem here, people, is, you know, just get a little more hyperthymic, things will be fine. So that's one of my worries about this move. And then another thing related is that we have, and this is again the philosopher in me saying, look, technological innovations are good. Some of these changes, this evidence-based medicine stuff, important, good stuff, right? But in transforming so radically psychiatry, that it's done more than just transform the way psychiatrists practice and treat, but the methods that they're using are now starting to dictate the ends. And this is kind of the more complicated point. But because, say, we discovered a compound that was successful at, say, relieving schizophrenics of certain traits with Thorazine. You know, wow, okay, so that was a successful model, and then, you know, we did some. They weren't random controlled trial studies, but they did some clinical trials on this stuff, and all of that stuff seemed to work, and we had good outcomes. So then what you start thinking is that's the way to do research, that's the way to do psychiatry, and so, you know, what you do is you want to give a treatment, you want to see if you can measure if there's a relieving of certain symptoms, you postulate the symptoms like the DSM does, and then the whole thing takes on its own life. It becomes this mechanized, blind process. It's not a therapist necessarily using clinical judgment, taking a history, thinking about the context. The you know, sort of whole process is running itself, right? Okay, that symptom, okay, this treatment, now let's measure it with, say, the Hamilton, you know, structured interview and see if there's been some relieving of symptoms. And if we can measure that, good, we've done a good job and out the door, right? And all that is good sometimes, but sometimes we forget that psychiatry is something that is a human, it's a human purpose-driven project. It's a practice, right? So in this talk, even though I'm having some concerns about the implications of neuroscience and bioengineering, I also want to affirm technology. I'm not a Luddite. I'm sitting here doing a webinar. And I'm not saying that people should go back to Freudian paradigms or Meyerian paradigms. I'm just saying that we have to step back. Maybe the philosophers need to tap us on the shoulder sometime and say, what is the purpose of our project here? And in psychiatry, I think the purpose is a healing project. It's a kind of, it's a moral project, right? I mean, we don't have to decide that we should treat people who are mentally ill. We don't have to decide that that's an important thing to do as a society, but we happen to, and we think it's a worthy thing to do. And so psychiatry exists for that reason. And I guess, again, the philosopher, I want to say, wait a minute, slow down. Why are you going, you know, just crazy with these drug making and all this stuff and these new tests and blah, blah, blah? If you're not asking yourself the basic question, what's the goal here, right? What are we trying to do? Are we just trying to make people function better in the context they are in? Do we want people to sit back and think about the problems of the context they're in and make changes to the context? And so I guess, you know, my last point there is, you know, maybe we need a little compassion and intensiveness. Maybe some of the traits that we're selecting for as prone or predictive of disease shouldn't be so devalued in this neuroscientific paradigm. And guess what? Those traits happen to be gendered in our culture. They're gendered as feminine traits, right? And so maybe we need to do a little reflection about the values and the assumptions we have about some of these traits and our goals as we move forward in this new neuroscientific paradigm. And essentially, that's it. That's the project that I've shared with you. Thank you. And I'm completely open to questions at this point.
And we do have some questions, Dr. Hansen, so we'll start here quickly. to keep it moving with Joseph, who sent in the following question. Being in public health now, how do you see the translation of any non-neuroscientific paradigm into the public sphere, especially when healthcare is increasingly mandated at the federal level based off of process measures?
So this is the kind of question that a philosopher has a lot of luxury thinking about, right? So, I mean, I am the kind of person that because I'm not in the healthcare field and I'm not being pressured, I can make analogies to what's happening to me as a professor in higher education, but because I'm not in it, I can step back and think, yeah, I can see that these practices are not being reimbursed, or they're not being recommended, or not being studied, or we're not changing our ideas of what would be a successful study of these things. And again, as a person not in the middle of it, I can say, whoa, wait a minute, why? Yes, I get economics. Yes, I get all of that stuff. But like, shouldn't we every once in a while step back and try to think about what the project is, right? Is the project, efficiency, efficacy, reimbursement, cutting down costs? Like, what's the project, right? Just like in higher education, what's the project? Liberal arts is, I have the luxury of being a liberal arts college, right? Because I can say the project is to make you a liberally educated, super interesting, engaged life learner, right? Who's never bored for the rest of your life, even when you happen to get a profession. But a lot of people don't have that luxury. So it's a really crappy answer, but I hear your pain.
Thank you, Joseph, for that question. We'll move on now to a question from Kathy. Kathy asks, is our pursuit of the idea of perfection reflected in our use of the, quote, quick fix of a pill? Do we take time to think about why we exist at all? Do we need to fit into the same mold? Who decides what is the right mold?
I love those questions. I hope you were a philosophy major or a sociology major. So one thing I want to just maybe separate out from your question is this notion of quick fix, because, yeah, I mean, we have this idea in our culture that the quick fix is the better fix, but I think the history to that is really interesting, and I think it comes out of a bunch of technological changes that led to modern medicine. And it was, again, the discovery of what we now call antibiotics in bacteriology, and the ability to first isolate and then synthesize compounds that could knock out a pathogen and make a person well. And so we started thinking of magic bullets. We thought, wow, we don't have to like bloodlet or whatever we were doing before. We can just get a pill, get them out of there. We get them out of the asylum. They're all better, right? So I think some of that comes from this idea that, wow, there are answers that can be found and people will be helped. But it also does have this sense, too, that we're impatient as a culture. We're a pragmatic culture. We're not a European, intellectual, reflective culture, however that gets spun out. And I think that's a problem, too. And I think that's why people wake up in their 40s and think about if they got the right job. Not liberal arts students, because they had a liberal arts education. But a lot of other people just, are just thinking about the day, the week, the month ahead, and all the pressures on them and the norms that are being pushed in those institutions they're in, and they don't step back.
Thank you for that question, Kathy. On to a question now from Karen. Karen asks, are you willing to go so far as to say the DM is designed for the benefit of the insurance companies rather than the benefit of the patient?
No, I won't go that far. Because I understand the argument, and I think that there are some historians of psychopharmacology that would say, especially with the DSM-3, that there was a lot of pressure to turn it into a symptom-based approach because, again, only a disease can you, I think once they changed the rules about prescribing certain compounds and stuff, only that which is a disease can be something for which a medication is indicated. So yeah, that was there. That was definitely there. And it was also there, too, because of changes in the way people studied the effectiveness of medications. And it also was an attempt to kind of maybe even broker a peace between people who were Meyerian or Freudian and people who were moving towards a kind of more neurobiological approach. Let's stop figuring out what the cause is and let's see what we agree on. And let's use the same language so that we can figure out what the cause is. So some of the stuff was good reasons. It was to have a reliable nosology, to be able to say when we use this word, we all mean it the same way because we're using these symptoms. So yes, some of it is driven by that stuff, but I don't think that's the whole story.
All right, Jenny. Doug would like to know, Others would tell you that it is far more irresponsible to prescribe medication without psychotherapy than to provide therapy without medication. Do you consider or review other fields in mental health besides psychiatry, such as psychology, that offers a much broader look at many of the issues you're addressing?
I don't directly look at psychology, but I think that question is interesting because at least on a college campus with the psychology department, I see psychology being pressured by the same neuroscientific paradigm as psychiatry. And it's this desire for rigor. It's a set of norms that people think are the more rigorous norms that, you can show maybe causality or you think about things in terms of mechanism, you can measure effects, you can model. And I think that so people who are clinical psychologists are probably dealing with that pressure too of the neuroscientific paradigm. So as a humanist and as somebody who thinks no matter what your illness is, whether it be arthritis or depression, or you have diabetes or whatever you're diagnosed with, I still think doctors should be human beings. I think doctors should still take histories. I think that the doctor-patient relationship should still be one of trust. That kind of goes back to my other article. So insofar as those are things that psychologists are doing, I'm promoting that as well. But I think that psychologists, clinical psychologists, are getting the same pressures as the psychiatrists, the GPs, all the people that are operating under this paradigm, to quicker, shorter-term treatments validated, figure out what the symptoms are, or figure out a plan of action and then address that action instead of kind of this more intimate encounter between the doctor and the patient.
Thank you very much, Doug. And this is a sort of a statement that's certainly an important one from Kathy. A bully might not be depressed, but not mentally healthy either.
Say more, Kathy. Yeah. I guess, I don't know if what you're, okay, I'll just guess. There are traits that people can have that cause harm in the world. There are things about individuals that because certain life circumstances, the way they've grown up, or the way they've been treated, or the way they've been parented. Bullies, I think about this a lot when my kid was in a different school, that hurt other people with words or hands. And we may not call them diseased, right? We may not say that they're something that we can diagnose, but we want to say that there's a mental component there. There's something that needs to be worked on. And that's, again, where I'm like, yeah, we do. We need to have a doctor-patient relationship. We have a lot of things we need to think about. We need to think about that person thinking as a person that thinks through problems, not just turn that person into a set of symptoms and find a protocol.
A point made here by Brian, your quote from Kramer that you mentioned, where Big Farm is pushing racing towards the study of pharmacoeconomics, and then he points out a pill tailored to the individual.
Yeah, yeah. You can imagine if, if you could make them cheaply, I suppose, and they would sell. It could happen.
And then Andrew points out, it seems like the positive traits selected by neuroscience tend to be associated with the problematic traits that result from hegemonic masculinity and seem to currently drive male socialization. Is that something that has come up in your research, or are you thinking about that issue?
Absolutely. And he knows because he's a former student of mine. Yes. I do think about that, but I want to say something that I think differently about now, which is I don't think neuroscientists, the ones who are doing, I'd make a distinction that there are people that are truth-seeking in science and there are people that are knowledge-extending, and that's a distinction I take from Helen Longino. So people that are truth-seeking are more trying to figure out what is it that I'm looking at? What is this that's in front of me? What is the brain? How does it work, right? And people who are, in this case, knowledge extending, who are, say, people who have this project, psychiatrists, psychologists, other mental health providers are trying to help somebody. They're trying to do something to make them better, and they're trying to take whatever knowledge we have to make them better. It's in that translation, without a lot of reflection, that those norms of masculinity get blindly promoted. I don't think that the clinicians are thinking, ha ha ha, let's get more female patients because they're going to come. I think the norms are in there and they're not reflected on.
Okay, we do have a hand up here, so I'd like to go to the line here. And Karen Heath, your hand is up. Feel free to ask your question to Dr. Hansen.
Are you excited by new research on the relationship between the gut microbiome and mental health?
I don't know a lot about it, but I do know that there is a book that someone just gave me called Gut Feminism, and I haven't read it yet. But I don't know a lot about that research. What do you think about it?
Oh, hold on there.
Oh, we got to
hold on, Karen.
Unlock you.
Let me bring you back. You're back, Karen.
Hello?
I don't know a lot about it either. I've just heard about it and was wondering if you knew about it. So I don't know a lot either. I just brought the question.
I think any questions worth exploring. I think the more holistically we can think about human beings and how those systems function together and the ways that they interact with the environments we're in are good things. I just always get worried. I guess what I'm trying to say in my talk is that when we think, oh, okay, the neuroscientific paradigm works because it worked in this case, so let's just focus there. So I think any kind of new area of research is promising.
We do have another hand up. This time it's Brian Gardner. And Brian, you are on here with Dr. Jenny Hansen.
Hello, Brian. Hello?
All right.
I was trying to play Dr. Fraser.
I was right with you, and I know Brian has typed in a few questions as well throughout.
Okay.
So, but going back here to our typed questions, we do have a comment here from Allison, who points out that perhaps what Kathy was getting at earlier is that the absence of mental illness does not necessarily equate with the presence of mental health or mental well-being.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, so what you're getting there is the fact that illness, no matter what kind of illness you're talking about, whether you're talking about mental illness or you're talking about things affecting physical systems, although now we think mental illness is that too because we're talking about brains, all of those things are social norms, right? We decide that it is no fun to have this particular problem because you can't function well in a certain context. There are some things that might be called illnesses that actually make you succeed in a certain social context, so we don't call it an illness, right? Like you might have an incredibly high IQ, and maybe in a way that's abnormal statistically, but we don't call it an illness necessarily.
All right, we have a question here from Linda. I love your characterizing of this as a moral project, but clearly it's infused with political overtones as well. What if I do not share your politics? How can I share your concern for the direction of psychopharmacology?
Well, I love that question, and I actually am stepping away as much as I can from the sort of strident political positions on this issue because there are many, and some of them questions already about isn't this all pharmaceutical companies or whatnot. I think that what's responsible for us liberally educated folks is to have the debate, right? That there are basic moral questions that we can all ask regardless of our political affiliation, and we should have a debate about what kind of social environment we want to live in, what we think are, what is the social project of psychiatry, what are our purposes. We aren't going to all agree, but I think there's overlapping things there that we can find some ways of working and living together. I mean, after all, we're theoretically a pluralistic democracy. We're allowed to live together with people that disagree with us, but we should still be able to have that moral debate instead of avoid it.
Well, Dr. Hansen, you have answered all of the questions that have been turned in. We do want to thank everyone for tuning in, but very quickly, we do want to point out that Jenny has provided her email address on the screen that you're looking at now, jhansen@stlyu.edu. And I know she'd be happy to continue the conversation there if you have follow-up questions and whatnot. And we did have one additional question come in here, actually a few, so I may have jumped the gun a little bit. Just as you thought, we were wrapping it up. We've got some more outstanding questions coming in. This one is from Rebecca. As a practicing therapist, I have seen a drastic shortage of psychiatrists and a move towards physicians managing psychiatric medications. That, coupled with the small numbers of family physicians, has impacted a lot of the way in which children are diagnosed and treated, i.e. short visits, quick diagnosis, without biophysical histories. I was an English major, so
Biopsychosocial.
there we go. We're going to let Jenny handle that one. A theme that has come across my desk is a continuous increase in children being diagnosed with ADHD, or adjustment disorders so that the children can receive services, billable services that is. How does this play into your theory?
Oh man, I love that question. I mean, I think a lot about, so when I was talking earlier about the norms promoted in some of the methodological changes in psychiatry, and I said efficacy and efficiency, I mean, I think that those are just broadly important norms to American society that we, and especially when we're dealing with institutions, that if we have big capacity in these institutions and we have a lot of work we're trying to get done and we don't have enough people doing the work, what we want to do is we want to find ways to change the people that we're addressing in those institutions so that they're manageable rather than think about our institutions, right? So you can think about this not only in school, you can think about this in, I volunteer in both a prison and a jail, and they medicate inmates, not necessarily because they have some kind of diagnosis, but because it's easier to manage them, right? They diagnose students because there's a lot of them, and it's not easy to manage a class of 32 plus students. So I think that shortage of practitioners, you know, trying to contain costs, yeah, it's a quick, to use that late phrase again, it's a quick fix.
Well, Ellen has her hand up. Ellen Miller, we are bringing you on here. Ellen, go ahead and ask your questions to Jenny.
Okay, I was just going to type it in, but I'll speak it up because I don't see the type thing. I was wondering if the propensity to medicate mental issues to, you know, achieve this defined character, like, can that have like a sociological impact on a broad scale, that we're creating a society that is deficient in compassion and deficient in critical thinking? I mean, even to the point where it could affect evolution.
I think these are all implications. That's exactly why I'm worried about it. I'm worried about it even just in a more concrete situation. You know, just go back to the woman being targeted in those ads, right? I think that we are asking women to change to work in environments that could have been changed better to accommodate families and different qualities, right? I think that instead of, you know, letting students, little kids, learn in the style that works for them, we're trying to make them all conform to one curriculum, and we'll find ways to make them change to make it work. I think there's broad sociological implications of all of these moves we're making, that if someone doesn't say, whoa, 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 like I said, philosophers or certain people should be doing, that's a real problem. We get stuck.
All right, Andy would like to know, and he does point out, forgive me if you've covered this already, but if not, how do you believe the trend towards genetic-based medicine and targeted treatment will impact your thinking and conclusions?
I mean, I guess I want to reaffirm that any technological development that relieves human suffering is a good thing. But when that becomes the focus, namely only relieving human suffering in that particular way, and we forget the human side of healing, that's what I'm worried about. So any technological innovation, I would argue, and this is just my own philosophical position, any technological innovation is going to switch the paradigm, the scientific thinking. It's usually the technological innovations that come first, and then we change the way we think about nature. And okay, that's going to happen. So then my point is, okay, but then what's the reason we're doing this? Why are we, you know, we're not doing the truth-seeking project when we're doing medicine. We're doing the healing project. So how does this tool fit into our purposes rather than we become tools of them?
Okay, we're going to go back and we're going to see that Brian Gardner's hand is back up. Brian, we're going to try one more time. If you're on speakerphone, we do need you to turn off the speakerphone and ask into turn that off and just talk into the phone normally. Otherwise, you are live here and unmuted with Jenny.
Hi.
Yes, I mean, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, perfect. As this relates, have you thought about the bigger implication is that maybe this is more of a bigger side effect of the capitalistic society that we live in, that this, you know, as you relate this to psychiatry and even, you know, ADHD and the Common Core, all the stuff that's going on, is this more of a bigger way of making a good worker?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it exactly in those terms, but I think the book that I have enjoyed the most on this is Michael Sandel's What Are Markets For? And he makes an interesting argument that's similar to what I'm doing here, which is that markets are good tools for allocating resources efficiently. But when we start thinking of all of our social problems in terms of resolving them with market values, which are the values I've been talking about here, like efficiency, utility, I didn't say that one yet, but utility is a big one, optimizing, that when that dominates our thinking about everything, which is obviously related to a capitalist system, yeah, that means that we have lost sight of a tool being useful for human purposes, and we have now let ourselves be driven by the tool.
All right, we do have time for just one or two more questions. This one is in from Kathy. Kathy wants to know, do you think the lack of close relationships results in more depression and therefore use more pills since they don't reach out to someone?
I don't know. That's an empirical question that I don't have the data for. I think it's an interesting question. I think that it is the case that people who are compassionate and empathetic will become, will be sad. You know, that they will have their hearts broken. I think I'm one of those people, frankly. And so I guess what I'm wondering is that always a bad thing? I mean, that's part of being human, and we need lots of ways to cope with being humans besides just medicating it away.
All right, and our final question is in from Joseph, and actually, Jenny, this one I'll take. The question from Joseph is, will this be available for download somewhere? And I can take that one, and yes, the answer is yes. All of our Laurentian lecture series are online at alumni.stlawU.edu, and just find the tab for the Laurentian lecture series, and we will have Dr. Hansen's, her lecture this evening should be up sometime on Friday. So we will have that to you, and so you can share that for those who are unable to be there. And certainly a comment quickly coming in here from Patricia that she needs to sign off, and she wants to thank you, as do we, Jenny. This concludes tonight's online Laurentian lecture. Thank you so much to all of you at home for participating. Immediately after the webinar, you will receive a link to a brief survey. I hope you'll take a brief moment to answer those questions, as that feedback will help shape future lectures. Thank you so much again to Jenny for her time, and for all of us on campus at St. Lawrence, we hope you all have a great night.